let the record show that we have a quorum present, and the meeting is called to order at 1:06 p.m. We have before us this afternoon, we're reviewing the update by the Auditor General on previous PAC recommendations, and we're dealing first with the government program supporting those in need, and our first witness is going to be Ms. Tamara Hurlston. So if I could ask the Sergeant to please bring her in. Thank you.
Mr. Chairman,
Mm-hmm.
as is the usual custom, I wish to declare a conflict in my present capacity as temporary minister for the Ministry of Community Affairs, who appear before us today, and as such recuse myself from active participation in today's proceedings. However, I will, as usual, request humbly of the chair that I be allowed to remain within the chamber as a bystander to listen in.
Request granted, and appreciate it.
Okay. Tamara Hurlston, Director of the Needs Assessment Unit. I swear by Almighty God that the evidence I shall give in this Honorable Legislative Assembly shall be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth.
Thank you. Mr. Sir. Unfortunately, you don't have a mic, so can we just move down one more seat?
Matthew Hilton of the Needs Assessment Unit. I swear by Almighty God that the evidence I shall give to this Honorable Legislative Assembly shall be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth.
Thank you, sir. First of all, let me thank you, Ms. Hurlston, for accepting our invitation to come and give evidence before the committee, and also for bringing along Mr. Hayden. Thank you. So, you've been here before. The format is that when you're answering the first question, for the record, just give your full name and your title. You don't need to give it before each answer, just the first time. So, I'll open the floor up for questions. Mr. Chris.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and through you, sir, I'd like to welcome Mr. Austin and Mr. Hilton to this committee. I think one of the things that we just want to make clear from very early, at least from my line of questioning, is that one of the things that we want to do is to make sure that the public gets a better understanding of what NAU does, because there are times when I'm speaking to members of the public, I realize that some social programs that should be in DCFS everything is being lumped into NAU to some extent. And I think it's important for the public to kind of understand the reason why NAU was created. So through you, Mr. Chairman, is it possible to ask the witness first to briefly explain the purpose of NAU and exactly what like the mission or the objective or the goal is, so the public can have a better understanding of what it is? Thanks.
Thank you. Tamara Hurlston, Director of the Needs Assessment Unit. The goal of the NAU, it was created in 2013 to deal with the financial aspect of welfare. Prior to NAU, Department of Children and Family Services, DCFS, was actually dealing with both the welfare and the social services for the country. During that time, it was established, or it was noted through a through a review that was done in 2010, that there should be a separation of the financial services from the social side of the Department of Children and Family Services. The reason being is that social workers weren't able to do true social work and be able to provide programs because they were dealing with all the welfare matters. Then they established the NAU in 2013. The idea behind that was that would allow the social workers to then be able to do intervention in the communities, and also to do proper social work without having to be bothered with the financial aspect. So that was the reason why the Needs Assessment Unit was created.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Just going from memory, last year, we noticed that we did, well, this Honorable House, in particular Finance Committee and the House, voted additional funds for NAU in terms of processing. One of the things that really also jumped out last year was the amount of money that we spent on healthcare with regards to indigent, seaman, and veteran. I think is NG 55, I think, if my memory serves right, in that line item. And one of the things that we are curious in terms of your overall budgeting or financing in terms of the whole healthcare costs. I mean, what has been happening in NAU? Why? Well, one, you guys needed more money, and two, I mean, what it is that we need to do differently, or that the public needs to be aware of, and for us, I guess, as policymakers, what is it that we need to change to make things a little bit different or a little bit better or more efficient to the public?
Well, from the aspect of the healthcare, we don't make the payments, we just do the assessments. NGS 55, correctly so, is for indigent medical, but it's handled by the Ministry of Health. So they would be able to answer more to the cost side of things. But what I could provide is the assessment side of things, because the Needs Assessment Unit conduct the assessments on behalf of the Ministry of Health. The Department of Children and Family Services then make a recommendation to the minister on whether or not someone should be approved for healthcare indigent services. The minister ultimately makes the decision. With that being said, in regards to assessments, this is not something that was calculated into our resources when we were established. The idea is that we would have been providing services that we currently pay for, such as poor relief, food, housing, etc. But with this onset of the indigent medical, we have actually done provided assessments to 527 persons in 2016, 422 in 2017, and 405 in 2018. So these are persons that came strictly for indigent medical that we were able to assess and pass the information on to the relevant parties to make the decision. So we don't do the costing, but it does take away a lot of our time, resources, because the assessment officers are now focusing on areas that it's not in our budget nor in our ambient to be doing. So that's one of the issues we have with our resources being spread thin amongst the services that we provide and also with the indigent medical.
Thanks very much. In terms of the assessment, between the five, well, almost 1,400 over the 3 years you had mentioned, are those individual cases, or in some cases those are repeat from each year? Would they be repeats?
Some might be repeats, but overall, since we've started doing the indigent medical assessments in our database, which we've had since July 2015, it's 1,080 individuals altogether between 2015 July to December 2018.
If you were to hazard a guess, what would that number be, I guess, prior to? I mean, if you...
Honestly, I wouldn't know. That information would be with DCFS, who handled the information previously, but the numbers jumped for, well, I guess several reasons. The main reason the numbers jumped was because HSA actually rolled out an initiative, I think it was in 2015, when they decided that everyone had to be assessed if they did not have insurance and they were Caymanians. You might see the posters up at HSA actually. You had to go to the Needs Assessment Unit to be assessed. That triggered a big influx of individuals coming in for indigent medical and for assessments. So I would say that the spike happened in 2015 once healthcare was then mandatory, health insurance was mandatory, and they sent Caymanians through to the NAU to be assessed for indigent medical.
One of the things I believe I've long held on to, and Mr. Chairman, just give me a little room to, I guess, just to frame the question. When I look at within the private sector, and considering that the pension contribution is 10%, it means then that over a 10-year period, you get basically 100% of your salary. So for every 10 years, you pretty much earn 1 year's salary. And if the average person is working for 40 years, it means that they would have earned 4 years worth of salary. And even if you were to double your investment that you have generated, 8 years of salary. And then when you consider that the mortality rate for men in this country the last time I looked was 79, and for women it was 84, it would mean then that if we are retiring people or forcing people out of the workforce at 65, a man would need 14 years worth of salary, and a woman would need 19 years worth of salary. But in essence, they're only generating 8 years worth of salary, in a nutshell, from the private sector. So then for me, the question is always, it begs the question, what happens when their pension runs out? And then on top of that, too, going back to the budget session that we had last year, I remember the CEO for Cineco at this time saying to us that the true cost of insuring a senior citizen is roughly around $1,300 to $1,500 per month. And then considering that within the private sector pension, the maximum that you can draw is $1,080 per month. It means then, just using today's numbers, that a person from the private sector going to retire, pretty much their pension that they're getting would not be able to even pay the true cost or the proper cost of their health insurance, much less what they would need to live. And the question, to preamble all of that, to ask the question, what analysis or what data have you guys collected to directly see the root cause of the people that are coming into NAU? Because for me, it's simple maths. At some point, the money is going to run out in terms of the private sector pension. And when I look at even NG 55, where the original budget started at 10.8 million, and I think it finished at 25.4 million when the dust had settled after 2 more increases. I mean, this is not something that is sustainable within the country. And then the question is, like, what data, what analysis have you guys done to basically provide the minister with what he probably would need to do to probably change the policy?
Well, the statistical data in regards to indigent medical would actually be held with Ministry of Health, and also the Insurance Commission. I think it's the Insurance Commission, Mr. Mervyn Connolly, because he actually keeps track of all the indigent medicals. So medicals that would have been granted prior to the existence of NAU would all be captured there. Some medicals were granted permanently, and therefore persons never had to come back to be reassessed. We would only have, we only captured the new persons that came on within the timeline that NAU's been there. So there's actually way more persons than what I've just said there that may be on indigent medical, but I don't have that information. That's captured somewhere else. In regards to what trends we see with our services period, which would also include, this would also include housing and with insurance, is that we have an aging population. And with that, that means that a lot of our elderly are coming in for healthcare, and they're coming in for other services. As you rightfully stated, pension in itself in the private sector, it's limited. So in most cases, you have a final drawdown at some point in time. What happens to that elderly person once that happens is they come into to the needs assessment unit for services. We have poor relief, which is the $750 stipend that we give to our elderly and permanently disabled. That's become more of a demand over the years because persons are not, elderly persons are finding it hard to be able to sustain themselves even on the minimal pension that they are receiving. So we have seen an influx in elderly persons coming into the office in addition to other clientele, but the elderly is one of our clients that we see that is demanding more services. And unfortunately, unlike the able-bodied, they're not able to go out there and get another job. They're there. So the country has to decide what's best to do with them. And unfortunately, it means more services through the NAU.
The only thing I would say is I know many 65-year-olds that are still able-bodied, but one of the biggest I guess barriers to them obtaining employment is that when you look at small businesses, and again, when you consider $1,300 to $1,500 a month premium for an elderly person on the health insurance side versus $200 to $300 for a person much younger, then we have created a system where we're literally encouraging discrimination against senior citizens in this country. And I think for us, that is, a very is an issue that we need to, that basically needs to address. One of the things I want to touch on is in terms of housing, because that's one of the things that we had to vote additional monies on, and it is becoming an issue. And one of the issues that even pop up during the old mortgage issue is that NAU would be willing to help someone in terms of paying rent, but of course, as long as they were basically in a different house, they wouldn't have to pay mortgage. Now, I do understand the differences between the two, where one is building equity versus something else, but the bottom line about it is, I mean, once you're making a payment, you're making a payment somewhere. You know what I mean? The question is, what do you see in terms of the trend? Because it is something that seems to be increasing every year. And then I do recognize from media reports that there were challenges in terms of obtaining some places to stay, where some people ended up in hotels. Yes. You know what I mean? So the question is then, what ultimately do you see as a solution? Because again, this is not something that we can just allow to continue.
Well, what we're seeing is with the increase in interest rates, naturally that means that landlords that have rental properties that's mortgaged, they're also increasing the rent. That's one of the main factors. In addition to, we do have a clientele that in some cases have social issues, and landlords discriminate. For instance, we serve mental health clients, and that in itself is a challenge. And for a landlord to take on a client with certain issues, they may be hesitant. Also, we have clients that may have children, and that's also one of the issues that we find with landlords not wanting to take on some of our clients that have larger families. In addition to some clients, unfortunately, having a reputation of destroying property. And because our practice is not to pay deposits, because as you know, our budget is limited, so in most cases we cannot afford it, landlords are at a loss if their properties are damaged by a client and then they move on because they have no means to pay for it. So those are some of the challenges, and unfortunately, because the good suffers for the bad, because landlords then paint NAU clients with a certain reputation, and that's become a challenge. However, what we have done to aid the landlords recently is we've started direct deposits in October, which we've piloted for some of our landlords, and we're hoping that in the near future that'll be something that we can offer for the landlords and some of our other vendors that we provide services to, that provide services to our clients. In regards to the housing issue for our clients and not having available rentals, I think eventually something will have to be looked after. We need a housing strategy for the country, and maybe something through the National Housing Trust. We did a visit last year, the Deputy Chief Officer and I, to Bermuda, and their housing trust actually take care of the welfare clients to find places for them to rent. So they're basically going out and locating the places and making sure they're fit to rent, and then securing these properties for the clients. I think that would be something that maybe the government can look into in the future. I know the ministry is up after me, and I know the Deputy Chief Officer is actually the chair on the Housing Committee, and he's done some work on investigating about housing issues, so he might be able to provide more of an answer. I don't think that the way we're doing it now is going to be sustainable for the same reasons, landlords being hesitant to rent to the needs assessment unit clients, etc. So I think a long-term strategy will have to be developed, and it's something hopefully I assume the government will be looking at in the near future, because it's going to become more and more challenging. As you know, interest rates went up in December and in January, and it's expected to go up another 2 to 3 times for this year. And our cap on rental right now is $1,200, and we are struggling to find places. Our clients are struggling to find places at $1,200 to accommodate families. So naturally, I can say from now, we will be back for additional funding for NAU services, because I foresee, as we did last year, we will run out of funds.
So a quick question. Sorry. The current system in terms of locating a house now, who does that? Because going back to your earlier answer to the question, in terms of what is your department does, there's a financial assessment. Or is it now that you guys are also now going out to find accommodations for people, or is that something the clients do and then they come to you guys?
Well, we wouldn't have the manpower to do that. They sometimes ask us to do that on behalf of the client, but unfortunately, with the officers we have, we're trying to keep up with assessments, so we can't play, real estate agents also. The responsibility is actually on the client to find somewhere and also to sign a lease. So the lease is between the client and the landlord, not between the government or the NAU and the landlord. What the NAU does is once you've secured a place, we guarantee a payment for a period of time. And we guarantee a certain amount for a period of time. But it's up to the client themselves to find a place to rent for several reasons. In the past, government under DCFS did actually go out and look for apartments and made commitments to landlords. And due to destruction, it cost the government quite a bit of money. So then we revamped the process and said it's the lease between the landlord and the tenant, and all government is doing is basically providing a guarantee of payment for a period of time.
Earlier mentioned 1,080 clients that you had assessed in terms of healthcare. Out of curiosity, what was the total amount of assessments are we talking about at NAU?
I don't have the assessment numbers right now, but I'll give you an example. A person can come back more than once for the year to be assessed for indigent medical. If you're elderly, it's usually one time because we're waiting on bank checks. There's a process that we have to go through, including seeing if you have any funds to provide health care to yourself. But in the case of someone who is under the age of 60, usually the Department of Children and Family Services would recommend a period of 3 to 6 months. Once that period is up, if you should be in need of services again, whatever ailment you had at that time, you have to come back to be reassessed. So an individual could be reassessed more than once during the year. But the numbers I provided you were based on actual persons. Mm-hmm. So that's not assessment. So naturally, the assessments would actually be higher than the persons. So for last year, for instance, it was 405 individuals assessed, but some of them could have been assessed multiple times.
Okay.
Mm-hmm.
Follow up on Chris's question about the indigent health care. How we changed the requirement for the Ministry of Health to sign off on people getting indigent health care?
As of today, make sure I got my timeline right. Within the last 2 days, I was informed by the chief officer that there has been some traction. There has been a meeting with the Ministry of Health, with the chief officer, to look back at the idea of health care reverting possibly to that ministry, and she may be able to provide more on what happened in the meeting. I wasn't part of the meeting, but what I was informed of is that they're looking into that, and with the possibility of stationing NAU officers over at Ministry of Health. I don't know if you recall back in when I came on in 2016 or 17, there was a mention of officers actually being at the HSA to provide assessments to persons needing indigent medical. That was a suggestion we made previously. It kind of lost traction, but the idea is that if you're only at the hospital and you only need indigent medical, then to have their own meaning HSA having their assessment officers, which would essentially be part of their finance team perhaps, because it's basically you're doing a means test, essentially. And they could do that for their clientele right there on the ground at HSA. Not all persons who are coming in for indigent medicals are actually able to, are actually also applying for welfare services.
So you're suggesting that the commitment to establish a position at the HSA some 3 years ago to do indigent assessment and the removal of the requirement for the minister himself to sign off on it has not happened?
No, it hasn't, but the chief officer, once she comes on, could give you more details in regards to the traction that's been made.
Okay. Because you have an established criteria to certify somebody as being indigent.
Correct.
Is that a complicated formula that only NAU people can do, or is it something that, as you suggested, an accounting officer or the admitting officer at the hospital? Because my concern is the patient who shows up at the hospital ill, doesn't have insurance, the decision is made to send him to the NAU. They have to find transportation to get to your office, to get the assessment done, which could take you more than a day because you have to check certain documentation and
Well, I'll actually say this. If it's an emergency, it's sent through the referrals office at HSA. So the client don't have to come to the NAU. The referrals office actually will take the minimal data, whether it's a copy of their ID, try to establish whether the person is Caymanian, and that's all we need. We send that straight on because it's an emergency. It's
Okay.
something that has to be dealt with right away.
Yeah.
But if it's for, healthcare that isn't necessarily dire at this moment, they send them through to the needs assessment unit to do.
But in most medical institutions, emergency is defined as a threat to limb or life. Right? I'm concerned about the little old man who comes from all the way from Northside by bus, or some family member drops him off at the hospital because he has to get his regular checkups, and he's told that he has to find transportation from there to your office, back to your office, and he may be denied health care that he needs. While it is not an emergency in the strict definition of the word, it is an emergency in his mind.
And that would be something the Ministry of Health would be able to answer, sir.
Would you would you consider, or have you considered making a recommendation to the ministry that government look at building some kind of social housing to which you would have access, on which they could build in the kind of difficult to destroy, like 6-inch block walls instead of sheetrock, as an alternative to not being able to provide housing for people?
Previously, and once the deputy chief officer comes up, because we've had discussions about this and he'll be able to explore more, but it has been mentioned in the past that we have this crisis with rentals and having our clients being placed elsewhere. We were taking advantage of at one point in time, the National Housing Trust homes that were there originally for sale. So we have quite a few of our clients in those homes also that we are providing rental to. And it was brought to the attention that maybe there's something similar to that might have to happen for some of our clients that are more difficult to place, especially persons like mental health clients, et cetera. And like I said, with the deputy chief officer coming on board, he has actually taken up the fact that since he's the housing chairman, that he was going to look into the possibility of what can happen with a housing strategy, or at least bringing it to the attention of the ministry responsible for housing.
I know this is completely outside your area, but are you aware whether the proposed mental health facility in East End has started, is likely to start, or is being deferred?
Honestly, I have no
Okay,
answer.
that's fine.
on
No,
that.
that's a good answer. I'll get it. I'll get to it by tomorrow.
Yeah.
Mr. Chair.
Mr. Chairman, through you to the director, can you indicate how many landlords are currently signed up for direct deposit rental payments out of the total amount of landlords that are serviced through NAU?
Sorry, through you, Mr. Chair. I can approximate, I think it's about approximately 150 landlords that signed up for the direct deposits. I won't be quoted on it because I would have to get the exact numbers. I didn't bring those statistics with me. But we would probably have somewhere in the gamut between the year of maybe 400 or so landlords that we deal with. Some landlords have said that they prefer to do the old way of just getting the checks. So they've elected not to send in their information, but we actually sent it to all the landlords that we were doing business with at that time to remind them if they want to take part in a direct deposit to provide their details. Some provided, some didn't, so yeah.
So notice was actually sent out to all of the landlords
Yes,
that you were going to provide this direct deposit.
Correct. What we
service.
did is when we did the checks prior to starting the initiative, we actually sent a letter to all the landlords with their checks to say this is what we're doing. There was I think in the public domain on the radio. We went out there reminding landlords if they want to take part in the direct deposits, they could also sign up. We actually went through our listing of landlords we previously did business with, and we had between the department and the ministry calling individuals to see if they were willing to take part in the direct deposits pilot we were doing.
Okay, can you indicate some of the reasons why some of the landlords did not sign on to the direct deposit? Is there a reason? Is it because of the fact that they don't have a bank account, or they can't don't have access to a computer? What's
That
the
might
reason?
very well be the case. In most cases, some persons I've heard said they didn't want to give their bank detail information, even though we said to them it wouldn't be your bank account details like a bank statement. We just need to know what account to put it in. Some of our older landlords opted out. I guess maybe they're not as tech savvy to go and do online banking to see where the payment is coming from. So they just opted to just have the check, but various reasons. But we called them, we provide the information. Many said, okay, no problem, but they never sent in the information. We tried recalling them, we sent out letters to the landlords, and it's just basically up to them to decide whether or not they want to sign on for the direct deposit.
Okay, through you, Mr. Chairman. So is there a certain date? What date of the month does those direct deposits, when do they hit the clients or the landlord's accounts?
What we try to do is we try to process payments before the first, because as you know, the first is usually when the rent is due. If you're doing month to month, usually it's on the first. So what we do is we batch the payments, we send it off to Treasury, and then Treasury would arrange for the direct deposits to happen. There's been a couple hiccups in regards to sometimes some payments are sent back because there were some issues there. I don't know if Matthew, but there has been some hiccups with the direct deposits in some cases with return payments and having to send them back out. But generally speaking, whether it's a check or if it's by direct deposit, we try to make the payment at least a week before it's due, knowing that it's due on the first.
Okay, thank you.
Mr. Chairman, through you, thank you. Well, I'm happy that you brought up the issue of the problem finding homes for people, and it's just so happened that a young man in West Bay called a meeting, identified land, the same very idea that the chairman talked about government assisted, maybe something government could build, the money you'd save in the rent. So what I will do, if that's something you are going to pursue, I will recommend this young man to maybe talk with you some of the brilliant ideas that he has on that as well. I know I've spoken to the minister on homes, but this is something that's very commendable that I heard you speak about slightly, and then the chairman. My other question, through you, Mr. Chairman. The question now, through you, Mr. Chairman. The last time you were here was a shortage of staff. Has that problem been solved with all staff members?
Actually, at the moment, we have approximately 4 vacancies at the NAU. We still have an issue with retaining staff retention. Over the last 2 months, well, we've had someone who resigned in December, and another one resigned yesterday. These are the officers, the needs assessment officers, and we had several resignations through 2018. The problem we have is, although the positions are there, well, sometimes we late recruitment, but then also by the time we get the additional support in, the existing staff is already under a heavy workload, and then there's a natural turnover. Then we have to go through the training cycle again with the new staff, and it's all because of workload. We recently had the civil service engagement survey results delivered to us, and we got actually staff satisfaction, management, organizational culture. It was all high, it was all great. Where we fell low was in workload. Our workload, unfortunately, the staff said that they felt that was a problem at the needs assessment unit, is the officers felt it was just too much work for the amount of staff that we have there. At the moment, we have also a vacancy in a manager position. We've requested from last year, October, for that post to be, someone to be seconded into the post to aid us with some of the issues that we're having. And we got an approval as of January 9th. It was approved that they would allow for someone to be seconded into that post to be able to give us some form of assistance. We also asked about the possibility of, doing a quicker recruitment on the needs assessment officers, because we know that we needed more officers than any other position right now, because they're the ones, the front line, dealing with the individuals to get the assessments and the aid to them. As of this afternoon, I saw a request from HR saying that they're going to do the advert for the needs assessment officers. We've also done a staff proposal several occasions throughout the year, and as recently as this week, especially after the last person resigned, saying what our dire needs are in regards to the personnel that we need, which includes a compliance officer, which is in the budget, the executive officer for Cayman Brac, because Cayman Brac only always had 2 individuals hired, and we know that we needed help over there, and thankfully, as of yesterday, I believe, it was approved for someone in the Cayman Brac to be hired on a full-time basis. We also had noted that we had two social work type positions at the needs assessment unit last year. I don't know if you recall and remember from the last time I was here, those posts were created. I didn't know at the time that they were created and they were advertised.
Stop. You did not know they were being created or advertised?
Not the last time and nor this time.
Okay,
So,
and let me interject a second. You as the director of NAU, because I know another department complained about this, are you having any say in who's being hired?
I propose what I suggest for budget and what I suggest for what our staff and needs are during the year, but the ultimate say does not lie with me. I do not have HR delegation to recruit for my department. That is handled and centralized at the ministerial level. Recently, we had 2 persons left. It was a social work coordinator and a social worker who were with the NAU for approximately a year through the last recruitment that had occurred. While they were there, the social work really wasn't being done. It was more like them helping with assessments and dealing with our usual operations. So what we saw as management is that having the social workers down at the needs assessment unit was not beneficial. What we believe is that the social workers at the Department of Children and Family Services, who's responsible for those programs, the social programs, would be a better fit, because it's almost as though the same thing that was in the report from 2010 that said that social work should be split from the financial services, it happened again where the social workers were bombarded with doing financial, so social work could not be done, hence the reason why the 2 units separated in the first place.
I know, through you, Mr. Chairman, if I was in your position, I would feel more comfortable knowing that I would be getting who I wanted for what. Would you feel more comfortable having some say in the hiring of people who are coming in under you?
I think most directors have a say, I would like to think, and that's the normal protocol. Most departments would manage themselves and then report to the ministry. Like I said, this ministry have HR centralized, but I do verbalize and in writing state what I need for the needs assessment unit. And at the moment, like I said, what we have is with the 2 vacancies left by the social worker coordinator and the social worker, what we saw the better fit would be is to bring in the needs assessment manager position, which you may have remembered in the last time I mentioned, to bring that position on board, which is doing more of the work that we need to be doing at NAU from what we see, and also to be able to bring on the compliance officer. And the reason why we have compliance is because we have legislation currently being worked on through a working working group, and in the legislation is going to require that we have a compliance component, which we're lacking now. And the idea is this manager and this compliance officer would take on those aspects instead of the needs assessment officers themselves trying to do some form of compliance while trying to do their other duties as an officer. So at the moment, I would say the better use of our resources from the NAU standpoint would be to have the manager, the executive officer in Cayman Brac, which was recently approved, as I stated this week, yesterday, and the needs assessment officers. We originally was agreed that we would have 18 needs assessment officers. We would like to retain that, but we did give up one of our, well, we were told that one of our positions would no longer be available to us out of the 33 that we had budgeted, because that position was going to be given to DCFS as a social worker. So we're down to 32 positions, but it would be good if we are able to retain our positions and use them the way in which we would like to use them for what we need to service our clients, noting that there are vacancies for social workers over at the Department of Children and Family Services.
Okay, Mr. Chairman, let me say, you always hear people complain. And when people get good, they don't say enough. I'm dropping a young athlete after a late match. I thought I had to drop the child to the district, which is another district from mine. And the child said, take me to where my parent works. And this was 9:30. And then the child told me where, and it was at your office. And the child, just before they get out, said, I'll be here again until 11 o'clock, 11:30 with mommy again, with a parent again tonight. And when I got there, I realized quite a few of your staff was there, and this was around 10 o'clock. And from what the child said, it seems to be a regular thing with the parent working there late. It is commendable. I know you never hear the good stuff, but hats off and respect to the work you all are doing under the trials and tribulations that you have to deal with. Good luck. Keep it up. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Can I?
Sure. Sorry, thanks. Yeah, one of the things I'm just trying to wrap my head around is what is the full complement of the department for everybody?
In the budget, it was approved for 33 positions. The ministry made a decision that one of the positions would go to DCFS as a social worker, and so we're down to 32 positions at the moment. If we are at 32, we then have 4 vacancies. If we're allowed to keep the 33 positions we had in the budget, we have 5 vacancies.
Okay. Of those 32 positions, how many are actually assessment officers, like people who do the assessment?
It's in the budget, it was 16 persons as assessment officers. The ministry proposed 18 persons be assessment officers, which we agreed to originally. We're down to, at the moment, actually having 16 assessment officers on staff. Like I said, we had 2 resignations recently. But what we're proposing here is to be able to bring on the 2 assessment officers if we're able to keep the additional head that we've lost. A compliance manager, operational manager, who will take the needs assessment manager post that we've previously mentioned in 2016. The executive officer post in Cayman Brac, because there's literally only 2 persons working in Cayman Brac, which is an assessment officer and an accounts person who was also trying to manage front desk. So having that additional body there to aid us with both accounts and with front desk. And the compliance officer, which will take some of the compliance components off of the needs assessment officer so they can focus on their main responsibilities. We do believe that's the best fit for this year. Our original staff complement was at 40 when we were created. That's what it was supposed to be, is 40. We've never been at 40. But since then, we've had several challenges thrown at us, one being the health. So that's an increase in clientele that we didn't expect to have to deal with. And also, we have approximately 800 clients last year that were never assessed for poor relief under the needs assessment unit. They hadn't been assessed for many, many years. And we did a project last year to try and identify these individuals. We've now identified or either terminated them or identified them. Now we have the process of going through and assessing approximately 600 and odd persons for poor relief to ensure that they actually still qualify for that service. We found persons who were either deceased, funds still going. We also found persons that were no longer living in the Cayman Islands, some as far as almost 20 years not living here but collecting a stipend. We found persons who were non-Caymanians receiving the stipend. We were able to remove approximately 127 persons through the reassessment process of even just establishing contact, which allowed the other persons that had been pending for several years to go on to receive the service.
One of the things I'm trying to, I guess, get a clearer picture of. The department was originally created for 40 staff. You're running at 32 now. So you're 20% below what you were originally created to do. And then on top of that, you've been the workload has actually increased above what you were originally tasked to do. But one of the things I'm curious, and I'm just trying to understand from an efficiency standpoint also, is like when you assess some of these people as being indigent, and in some cases they're medical boarded, I mean, how long do they come back again the next 6 months to be assessed again? Or are those people that you can say, well, at least they're good for 2 years? Because if a person is old, and I mean, like, what is the frequency? And then the next thing I'm trying to figure out, from a compliance officer standpoint, what exactly is that position looking for them to be compliant with? Is it a situation of people getting benefits that they shouldn't get? And if that is the case, then if we do find people that are getting benefits they shouldn't get, are we prosecuting those people in terms of what it is? And then one of the last thing I'm trying to just understand, how long does it really take? I mean, from a person comes in, sit down, how long does like one assessment on average would take?
Okay, so
I know it's a loaded question, so
I'll try to remember some,
Yeah.
remind me if I forget some pieces. In regards to, I'll start with the last one, the assessment process. The assessment process from time of coming into the office and being assessed, because you have to book an appointment. Appointments are pretty good now. I think we're maybe a week and a half out. It was months previously. So we've gotten that down. The assessment process usually takes, depending on the type of person that we're interviewing or the household configuration, it can take anywhere between an hour, on extreme measures, maybe 2 hours to assess the individual. The person is actually bringing in paperwork to prove their financial circumstances and any other circumstances. For instance, if someone is deemed to be unfit to work, permanently unfit to work, they have to provide medical information regarding that, which we provide them with a medical where HSA would provide details saying the person is permanently unfit to work, so they should have access to services for a period of time. In regards to the length of time that persons have to be assessed, if it's someone who is elderly or permanently unfit, it's every 2 years. It's so they don't come in every 6 months to be reassessed. It's every 2 years. In the case of indigent medical alone, I know that they approve that every 3 years. So you only have to be assessed for indigent medical if you are permanently unfit or elderly every 3 years. In the terms of families who are unemployed, we follow up every 3 months, but we assess them every 6 months with the hopes that maybe their circumstances change, they have gained employment, and we can look back to see what services may need to be adjusted. So they're not coming in every 3 months as previously was being done. We're actually assessing them between 6 months to 2 years, depending on the category. Single able-bodied persons only get assessments for 3 months out of the year, so we only see them once out through the year.
Okay, thanks very much for that. So what I'm trying to figure out now, if you have 16 assessment officers, and they can do on an average 4 per day, that's 64 per day, and over a 5-day work week, that's roughly 5, 6, 30, 320. So you're talking about doing 320 assessments per week.
There's other parts of the assessment besides just the assessment. You have to follow up with the services. You have to provide the different types of services. Documentation, we have to follow up with the client for certain documents, like if they have to file for maintenance. There's a lot of other administration that goes into that. I think last time I might have brought the assessment process and the follow-up. I didn't bring it this time, but I can provide it after if you would like. But there's a lot of follow-up. So it's not that you see the individual today and they get their services, it goes away. You have to have case management. You have to follow up with the individuals, which is hard to do when you have, an average clientele of 75 to 100 cases or 100 and something cases per an officer.
One of the things then that has been one of the biggest challenges in terms of even going back to the housing issue has been the delay in payment. Is it a situation then that NAU is processing the payments late, or is it a situation that Treasury has set days in which they, do their runoff or they cut off? Because that's one of the things that has been an issue, and I found it out the hard way when I found out that even you guys were where you guys end up being, your offices being located, is I found out that some landlords didn't even want to rent commercially to government because they didn't want those people also coming,
Yeah.
people that need help. So I'm trying to figure out what is it that makes the payment so late.
In regards to
Don't be afraid of Matthew up there. You can, if it's Treasury, don't be afraid to call him out.
No, I will say this. We've been working very well with Treasury, even with getting the direct deposits off the ground, because we've been wanting that for quite some time. I'm thankful that they actually went ahead and pushed with that, and I think more to come in the future. So I wouldn't blame Treasury. What I will say is there is a process to get things done, and the reason why we wanted to go with the direct deposit is once you have a payment, so I'll give you rent. Rent is the main one. So a rental guarantee, which is what we sign with the client to say, and the landlord to say, we're going to guarantee a payment. Once we approve a service for a client, both persons have to come in to sign. The landlord has to agree to the terms, and so does the client. What oftentimes happens is they don't sign at the same time. We cannot initiate that contract until both signatures are on there. So even though one might have signed 2 weeks ago and another one comes in 2 weeks later and signs, it's not until then that we can actually trigger the payment. Then an officer enters the service and accounts then go ahead and start the payment process. The payment process then is run through the ministry. The ministry takes the batch to Treasury. Treasury then cuts the checks. The checks are then sent back to the ministry to distribute amongst their departments. The checks are then eventually collected, sent back for collection to the department. Then the department, what we've done, previously it was that we would, when it was done by DCFS, they would actually have the checks at the front desk where the landlords then had to come in for the checks. We eliminated that process. We do registered mail, which was better than what we had. I still don't think it's the best, but it's what we had. So we then sign up all these checks, send them through registered mail, so the landlords would know how to track these individual payments. We're hoping to get rid of those steps in between there by doing direct deposits, because if we're able to do the direct deposits, we're going to save about 5 days between when the landlord gets their first payment or their payments, because we don't have to worry about sending, the batches going over and then physically having to collect the checks and then sending them through mail, which also takes several days to reach to the mailbox. It would be directly into your account like payroll would be for government employees.
Mr. Chair, just to add to that, thank you for outlining the process. We had some concerns, particularly with the part of the registered mail. As you can imagine, that's not the most efficient way of getting something done, knowing that they have to get a slip in their post box and then have to go to the office to collect the registered mail. We had a number of concerns, besides all the process leading up to that point, which is the ministry sending a check to Treasury, a payment run to Treasury, Treasury cutting the check, and so on. So there are some things that we can do, and we've been working closely with the councillor and with the ministry staff to try to eliminate a number of those steps, and one of those is direct debit, which I think is coming along. Some of the information we haven't received from landlords, so they're saying, okay, we would like to sign up for it, they haven't given us information and so on, but I think we'll get to the point where it can be a much more efficient process with direct debits. And just to point out, in the past we've had, in regards to Treasury, we actually had a complaint on a similar matter from a landlord who was saying that they were told that it was Treasury delaying the process, and when we went back, we actually went to our records. In this specific case where the complaint came in, we'd received the request at 10 o'clock, and we actually issued the check to the ministry at 2 o'clock. So it was a 2-hour delay, basically because of the Treasury's process. So not a delay really, but just a process between the time Treasury receives it to the time we send out the check. So I just want to make it clear that Treasury, we're holding up our end, but I think it's the process overall needs to be refined, and I think Tamara and the ministry and councillor are working diligently to try to get that refined to a quicker process. And I do hope that landlords can work with us to get that information, and so we can get that process fine-tuned, because the direct debit would work very well for both the tenants and the landlords, I think.
Yes. Sorry.
continue.
I was just gonna say, if and when you do get someone saying they want to sign up, if you just direct them through to the NAU info email, because we've actually been sending out those forms to our existing landlords, so it's not a problem. We can even share with Treasury so that if you get a call, you can actually send them that form. Yeah.
Yeah, I'm sorry, just going back to the compliance officer, just to wrap my,
Can I just interrupt? I have a couple of questions around this payment business. 'Cause I keep hearing things have to be approved by the ministry. Is the NAU a department of the ministry, or is it the ministry?
The payment cycle happens that way for all ministries in regards to, we batch the payments, we approve the payments, but the payments itself, the check, the physical check is approved through the ministry, through the chief officers, and that's for every ministry. You can correct me if I'm wrong. That's the.
So generally the procedure, Mr. Chairman, is that each department will enter their payments, and then the CFO does what they call a payment run or a payment batch. So all the payments that have been entered by all the departments will be run at one time. Normally a few times per week they'll do check runs or payment runs.
What is the purpose of having that done at the ministry level rather than at the department head?
It's a secondary check because the chief financial officer being responsible for the budget, they would have their knowledge of the payments going through and so on.
There's no devolution of responsibility to the department head.
So there's a process where we have someone in the department who enters the payment and then another person in the department that approves the payment. So the CFO isn't going through necessarily every payment, but through the process of a payment run, they'll be aware of what is being paid out, and then they can investigate if they'd like to have further information on each payment. But it's just a check and balance to ensure that the CFO is aware of what payments are going out.
If I can also clarify, because my understanding is the CFO is runs the batch payment, but it's actually the chief officer that's responsible for signing off the batches.
No, not in all cases. The CFO can sign off a payment run.
Okay,
In the
in
case
our
of an
ministry.
executive payment, that is, some of your payments would be executive.
It is executive.
Okay, in this case, then yes, you'd
It's
have
a chief
chief officer
officer.
signing off for executive payments. For entity payments, a chief financial officer would sign off. So there's two different type of payments we process.
one of the things, looking at the growing numbers that we have, I'm trying to determine how much coordination is between your department and DCFS. Because before, everything was under one umbrella, where DCFS runs the programs and you guys do the payments. Like, when it comes on to taking staff, taking the your customers off assistance, I mean, like in terms of trying to help find employment and so forth, who normally does that, or how does that come about?
Through you, Mr. Chair. Well, what we actually, at the moment, there's WORC, which was formerly NWDA, National Workforce Development Agency. And what happens is we refer our clients to the entities that deliver the programs that they need. So for instance, in the case of unemployed, we require that they register with the NWDA for employment and take part in whatever programs they have available, because they are the agency developed under government for the unemployed. In regards to, say, drug rehabilitation, we refer persons over to drug counseling for those issues. In regards to parenting, family crisis center, so any program that's being delivered either by a private entity, NGO, or a government entity, we refer our clients there. The idea and if you look at the annual budget statement for the Department of Children and Family Services, which I didn't bring that with me, but you will be able to see in there that part of their deliverable is actually programs within the communities. It was also mentioned in the report that divided the two entities. So the idea is that eventually it would be to a position where they're delivering the programs and we're able to just refer our clients then to whatever other programs they have, because there are programs existing across the country in different organizations. NAU is supposed to concentrate on getting the deliverables of financial the aid into the hands of those who are in need of financial aid, and concentrating on that, which is why my suggestion and our management team at NAU would suggest that, social workers would remain with social work, to be able to deliver those programs, which wouldn't be just to the needs assessment unit clients. It would actually be to the general public, because we're looking for intervention and prevention. And in order to have prevention, you need to be able to have these programs within reach to the general public to avoid persons falling into, maybe needing the needs assessment help, whether it's with budgeting, whether it's with, other family social issues that they would be equipped to deal with as social workers, which will then allow the needs assessment unit to concentrate on making sure that we are providing the means, their financial needs, so they wouldn't have that as an excuse to say why they can't get to their programs. We would remove that barrier. Just like NWDA is working on removing the barrier of unemployment by providing programs to those individuals. So the idea is that we would facilitate the assessments and provide the financial needs, which is our mandate, and then DCFS and the other entities would provide their services, their programs, but we would be able to refer our clients. But a holistic approach for the country would be that these programs would be available to all, using maybe the district's civic centers, so everyone would have access to it, because we want to have prevention measures also. There are new persons that would come on to welfare services or into any other social issue, whether it's drug rehabilitation, that could happen every day. But if we have some preventative measures in the districts, programs out there administered, it would ease some of the stress we have on NAU. But it's not just NAU clients that they would be servicing.
One of the things, I guess, first of all, thanks very much for that. That's one of the things I just want to be clear on, is when you look at, you were mentioning the different types of customers that you guys would be looking to offer assistance to. Like some cases you have like some cases where the people have mental health issues. The question is then, like, what kind of training and development do your team have? Because when I'm thinking of financial assessment, I'm thinking of accountants. But then I'm thinking now of your clientele in terms of the match now between bean counters, no offense to accountants, but I'm one, I guess I can say, and people basically coming in that would need, I guess, a certain amount of TLC, because accountants aren't known for TLCs. Like, how do you guys manage that in terms of like the staff that you have? Because I think the reason why I'm asking this question, I think a while back I remember seeing an ad for, I think it was a social worker, but I remember looking at the description, it almost looked like it was a NAU person. So I really couldn't kind of tell the difference between the two. So, but I'm just trying to understand the coordination between DCFS and NAU in that regard.
Well, in regard to our officers, the needs assessment officers, most of our needs assessment officers are not accountants, actually. Okay, they come from different fields where they've worked with a vast variety of clientele, or customers. So in the case of what type of training we do sensitization training. We have a social worker on staff, which is actually my deputy, Matthew Hilton. And basically we take them through a rigorous training program. We also work very closely with the Ministry of Health, and they're also they have also established programs for our officers to attend to be sensitized to how to deal with mental health clients. So we have had appropriate training. We have persons from different walks of life walking through our office, whether they're mental health or just going through a stressful situation. So we do have constant customer service training on how to deal with difficult clients. So we do ongoing training on how to deal with our clientele. And I must commend the officers. They do an excellent job. They know how to de-escalate situations, and they know how, especially when we know it's a mental health client, how to work around the individual and make sure that they get the care that they need. And in the case, if it's someone that we cannot handle, because we've had persons that perhaps want to commit suicide, there's a standard procedure for that. We make sure we call, the police then go ahead, and if it's the ambulance that's needed or whatever the next protocol is, to secure that person, to make sure they're not a hurt to themselves nor to anyone else. So the staff is trained on how to handle those different type of clientele when they're in their presence.
I want to follow up a little bit on the whole EHR area, because we're back to where we were July last year, and that is rather unfortunate, because the government minute, which was done in June 2018, states that in the 2018-19 financial year, 33 posts were funded in the NAU budget. The ministry is therefore very pleased to inform the committee that the NAU is operating with 32 of the 33 posts. Efforts are underway for the final post to be filled. Why is it taking 6 months to fill a post? And you
Well, what we've had, unfortunately, due to the workload, like I said, we had a high turnover.
yeah.
So where we may have recruited some, others exited. So we were always
Well,
playing
in
catch
that,
up.
In that 6 month time period, how many people came through the door and how many people left?
I don't have the exact figures. Do you recall? But I'll ask my deputy to start working on some numbers if he can remember,
Okay.
and then I'll come back to that question.
I don't understand why you don't have HR authority to recruit if you're a department. Take me through the process. You now need somebody, right? And I found it kind of interesting that a lot of things need to be happening this week and last week. But take me through the process of what happens when you have a vacancy. What's the process?
The standard process now would be that I identify the vacancy, and terminations are sent in the case to the ministry. They then write a letter to acknowledge the termination. Previously, maybe 3 or 4 years ago, I handled all of that. I would do the termination letter, and then I would start the recruitment process. In this circumstance, with it being centralized at the ministry then would trigger when to advertise that post. What we do from the ground at NAU is we would then advocate to say, well, we're in need and what our needs are in regards to resources. We continuously do that. I would say probably just about every month I say what needs we have. And then it's to the ministry then to actually send out the advert, do the matrix, do the short listing, and then they'll appoint us to the panel.
So you have no control over the timing. It's all timed and done by the ministry.
It's at the ministerial level, correct.
Okay. And are you involved in an interview panel?
Yes, we are usually one of the NAU, whether it's myself or the deputy. We're usually on most of the panels. Some panels wouldn't require us depending on the level of the position, but they do select at least one individual from the needs assessment unit to be on the panel.
I believe it's a common thing for new recruits to do tests.
Mm-hmm.
For your staff, do you administer that test or is that administered by the ministry?
Everything regarding recruitment is done by the ministry.
And I would assume that if somebody fails a test, they're automatically eliminated.
I know the chief officer is coming up next, and that would be something that she can answer to.
Oh.
But previously, that's how when NAU was handling recruitment, especially for needs assessment officers, what we've done in the past is we actually did a matrix where it was weighted. So the test was weighted a certain percentage, and then the interview itself is weighted a certain percentage, because we acknowledge that sometimes persons are nervous in exams and may not do as well as we thought. And during the interview process, we may have established that they may be a good fit, so we weight it to see, yeah.
In instances where you may have somebody recruited for you that doesn't fit your bill, doesn't speak enough English,
Mr. Chairman.
what do you, if you recommend that that person be terminated or not be hired, is the person still hired or is that a no-no?
Mr. Chairman, not sure the post that you're referring to, but I will say NAU is, since November, 100% Caymanian, but we did have a temporary staff member on who was also Caymanian, but the first language was not English at the front desk. And maybe that's where someone might say the language barrier might have been. But In any instance of any suggestion in regards to staffing, I always make recommendations to the ministry whether or not I think there are persons performing or not performing and whether they should continue with our organization. In regards to the ministry, they make the final decision on whether or not they move forward with.
How many instances, if any, has it been where the ministry has not accepted your recommendation?
Hold on, Mr. Chairman, sorry. I have to interject a little bit, if you don't mind. The chief officer is coming up afterwards, and I think we should probably direct that question to the chief officer. What I don't want...
I'm just laying the
I know, I'm
groundwork
just...
so the public will understand.
Yeah,
if the chief officer tries to say, this is not my area, it is well documented.
Well, yeah, I know, but I don't want to get anybody in trouble.
No, I'm not calling
No.
And on people's financial information, people's assessment criteria, people's assessment results, to most people that is somewhat confidential, if not highly confidential. If you have a staff member who raises that kind of information in the public, what happens?
Well, if we're aware and we have evidence that someone did divulge that type of information, we would have addressed that, the staff member, with the proof that we have and give them a warning. If it's critical enough that we have proof, because in most cases, I must say, when we've had something like that in the public, there was no proof that that was the scenario. So it was kind of hard for us to back it up. But either way, we talk about confidentiality at our department very often. And if we do, even if it's not true, we speak to the officer again and remind them about the importance of confidentiality, not just within the department, but especially when you're outside of the department, because you should not be discussing client information outside of the department.
Okay, earlier I think you stated that yesterday or today, you currently have 4 vacancies, some of which is because people resign.
Yes, we have currently 4 vacancies. If we remain with the 32 individuals or 32 positions that the ministry is currently allowing us to have, but if it's the budgeted positions of 33, we would actually have 5 vacancies.
Okay. When people resign, is an exit interview done, and if so, who does it?
That's all administered by the ministry. Previously, we did do the exit interviews. We did our HR in-house, but it's all now administered by the ministry.
Okay, so the ministry does an exit interview.
Correctly so.
How is the findings of that interview communicated to you, or is it communicated to you? Because the purpose of an exit interview is to help you as a director, first of all, determine why people are leaving. You have presented to us that you believe it's because of the workload and people get burnt out, and you never had enough staff to run the place and distribute the workload fairly. So people are leaving because of the workload and because they're getting burnt out. But in the absence of exit interview information, that's an assumption.
Well, the only thing that I have that is concrete is actually the civil service engagement survey, which luckily for 2018 we just received the last week from PACS, and that actually have in there that is the biggest one of the biggest concerns is workload. Also, even though I'm not charged with the responsibility from the ministry to do the exit interview, when persons resign, I always have a one-on-one with my staff to encourage them in wherever they're going, and then I also give them ask them for feedback, even though it's unofficial, because the interview is conducted at the ministerial level. Of the exits that's happened over the year, I don't recall ever receiving the results of those exit interviews. I asked my deputy, and I don't think he's received any either, so we haven't gotten those results. But unofficially, in discussions with the staff before they leave, we usually have a discussion just to feel how they're feeling about things, and it's the usual workload. And like I said, the engagement survey, which I did bring a copy here, but it also spoke to that. It actually identified that was one of the biggest concerns from the staff. It is workload.
Through you, Mr. Chairman, to the director. The government acknowledged that there's a high number of clients being supported by a small number of caseworkers. The remedy is to hire more caseworkers. Why hasn't this been a priority to hire more caseworkers? And is there funding for that, or those positions aren't funded?
Well, through you, Mr. Chair, that's what I was referring to with our vacancies. There is funding right now to hire 5 additional posts, which I mentioned before. If we are able to keep the one post that was originally last year given to DCFS, but they still have vacancies. If we're able to retain the head count of 33, we would have 5 vacancies that we can fill, 2 of which were recommended to be needs assessment officers. The others is to deal with the rest of the operation. And we do advocate for additional resources. In addition to humans and to having additional staff on the ground to deal with the assessments, one of the other areas that we've always asked for many years is for the database to be reviewed, because the database should be capable of doing more than it's currently doing. Mm-hmm. Thankfully, through the advocacy of the Deputy Chief Officer, it was approved in September, I believe, of this year, that we actually have someone reviewing our database at the moment with the hopes of also gaining additional efficiencies to aid the officers and the supervisors with being able to get through assessments on a timely basis. Something as simple as knowing when someone's services are expiring or when someone is due for a reassessment, that's all manual. So if you have 75 to 100 clients, you're expected to remember all of that. The database does not spit that information out for you. What we're trying to get to is where the database, as you log in, will let you know what clients are coming up for reassessment and what services are about to expire. The onus is really on the client to come back in when they know their services are expiring to say whether or not they still need services. Unfortunately, that doesn't always happen. So we're hoping with the efficiencies being created within the database, that would aid the officers and the supervisors also. It'll also aid us with reporting, because right now our reporting is very manual. The data is in a database, but to extract the information, we have to manually manipulate the data, which can lead to errors. And again, we've been asking for the database to be reviewed for many years, and as recently as 2017, I think it was around November, but thankfully the Deputy Chief Officer was able to push and advocate for us, and we now have someone in since September to review the database to allow for better reporting also.
So what sort of time scale is in place to upgrade the database?
Maybe the ministries come on next. The Deputy Chief Officer might be able to give more of a time frame, but from what we're seeing, because the consultants meet with us and also at the ministerial level, there are some where they're working also with computer services, so there are some other dependencies. So we're not, it's gonna have to be a phased approach, but we're hoping that we at least can get to use some of the benefits from this review of this database within hopefully the second quarter of the year.
Okay, I have another question on HR. You mentioned that. Sure.
Sorry, just want to get something on the database, just for my own understanding. If you have 16 officers now and they're running between 75 to 100, you're talking between a total of 12 to roughly 1,600 clients. And if you say you need 2 more, you're talking about another 75, well, another 150 to 200. So are we looking at basically the amount of clients that NAU are processing is anywhere roughly like from 1,400 to 1,800?
Well, what we're at the moment servicing for clients, we have approximately, last year, 2018, rough estimates, because again, I pulled this together and it's manual data that I had to pull together, and I'm not quite completed with the statistics as yet, but it is about 2,040 families served last year. Of those families, for temporary services, which would include the rental, the food, utilities, that sort of those sort of services, it was 1,192. For poor relief, which is the 750 stipend that they receive monthly, which is reserved for the elderly and the permanently disabled, that was 1,056 clients. So in total, that was 2,040 clients that we served, because some of the poor relief clients are also receiving other services. So approximately 208 clients that are receiving the poor relief stipend are also receiving other services, maybe rent, food, etc., because the 750 is inadequate to service them. With that being said, then the officers we have, basically it would be the 2040, assuming this does not increase, to be split amongst the officers that we have for assessments. We do have in this balance here approximately 600 clients that we have identified through the reassessment process last year for poor relief that they still have not been assessed, because this doesn't take into consideration the indigents, which is the numbers I gave you with the 422, I think, for last year. So this is just NAU clients. In addition to the NAU clients receiving our services, there's the 422 clients that we're assessing also for HSA for indigent medical for the Ministry of Health.
In terms of your waiting list, you had mentioned earlier that you had a waiting list. I mean, roughly how many people, you say, I think I was waiting for poor relief, how many people we have roughly on that list?
The number is ever changing, because what happens is, before it was an application process for poor relief, you would apply, and it was kind of long and tedious. Now what we do is we use the same assessment process, the same form that we use for all of our other services. You would just say, what else? And we even preempt. So what we've done last year is we went through the database and saw everyone who was over 60. We saw whether or not they were getting poor relief. And if they weren't getting poor relief, we started the process of processing their applications to see when space does become available, if they could go on to that service, and then come off of other services such as food and utilities.
You mentioned space available. So do you have a quota for poor relief that you cannot exceed, not in a monetary fashion, but numbers of persons?
Correct. That's
So what happens?
948.
What happens to the people who are outside your quota?
They get other services, temporary services. They would get food, access to food and other services. But as you can imagine, there are other services that the elderly especially would need funds for. And therefore, that's why we try to get them the poor relief as quickly as we can, because, for instance, catching the bus, that costs cash. That sort of stuff takes cash. But when we're only giving services such as rent, food, etc., that wouldn't cover those expenses. Hence why that's reserved mainly for the elderly majority.
Okay. From a policy point of view, would it be simpler if government had a figure which is required for minimum living standards, which people got, and the people allocated it themselves to their own expenses based on your assessment, and
that was something previously discussed even before the creation of NAU, and then recently with looking at the possibility of a standard rate, where you would basically say what the standard cost to live in the Cayman Islands is based on the family dynamic, and determine what that amount would be, and then basically provide services. But in your suggestion, which would be a good suggestion, provide maybe the cash stipend, whether it's on a card to monitor, etc., so that they can control how they use their funds. There would be a lot that would need to go into that concept, because you need to make sure that there is no fraud, that they're using the cash for what they're supposed to use it for. But at the moment, something as simple as even having more of a standard rate for elderly. Say if we think an elderly would need $1,200 to survive, and say that if you get this standard rate, then other services would not be accessible. So you wouldn't have to double dip, and you would know that the elderly is cared for. That's something else that might aid with both the elderly and their families, because when it gets to the point where the families are unable to afford taking care of their elderly, they come into the NAU for PINES placement or for care, which is costing the government even more. So something like that to start with could be looked at for even the elderly, to the stipend to be increased.
Just on the database, before I know my colleague has a question on the HR side. the number that you gave us in terms of total, would you be able to give us a breakdown between like rental assistance versus those who receive food vouchers and like those who get temporary financial assistance and I guess like permanent financial assistance and that kind of stuff? I don't know if you have that information with you, but that's even a ballpark.
I have some preliminary. I don't have it by service type as yet, but I'm working on that information. We publish that information annually. But in regards to temporary, the temporary service was at 1,192 families. Remember, families is one or more, so it could be. I'm not sure if persons served as yet. That's what we're working with the database on. And for poor relief, which is the 750 stipend, we service 1,056 individuals. And that doesn't mean 1,056 was on at one time, but throughout the year with persons coming off and going on, it was a total of 1,056 individuals.
Okay.
It was just one last question here. You mentioned you were going to recruit a needs assessment manager. Didn't you have someone, does the department not have someone at that level already? That's working?
For that post, no, we don't. We have supervisors at the moment that review cases. The manager post is dealing more with operation and compliance. And that post we originally had in our structure from the creation of NAU. It was recruited for, never filled. There were some issues with the recruitment. And it is now, again, an opportunity for us to get that post filled, to fill some of the gaps that we find at our department that we're in need of.
So your social workers, they're the ones, they answer then to the supervisors?
The needs assessment officers,
The needs assessment
yes,
officers,
answer to
yeah.
supervisors,
Okay.
correctly so.
And then the supervisors would then answer to the manager, this needs assessment manager, or not necessarily?
No, that manager, in what we have as a structure for NAU, those supervisors usually go to the attention of the deputy director, and the manager is just another tier that also reports to the deputy director, then they report to me.
Okay, thanks.
So, Mr. Chairman, just one final question, because I recognize the witness should have been here for an hour and she's more like an hour and a half. Just going back on training, looking at the staff turnover and the burnout issue, I mean, I know there's some things you can probably give training for, but I'm trying to get a better understanding in terms of the dynamics or what it is that your team have, the skill set that your team possess. Because you were saying earlier that a lot of them weren't accountants, so which is in a way a good thing. But in terms of the type of personality, because it takes a special kind of personality to do this kind of job. And one of the things that I don't want is for us to, you be training people up and they still basically end up leaving, so that's money kind of, I don't want to say wasted, but
It is, yes.
yeah, but in terms of the kind of training, especially with the different dynamics of people coming through the door, like when you're assigning cases, do you look at a particular person to say maybe a mental health case, or one if it's a family in crisis? Like what kind, like how do you assign the different cases, and what kind of, and typical, like what does the training entails?
Okay, so, sorry, through you, Mr. Chair. What we do currently is once we interview someone and they're selected for a post and we put them through the same training, everyone goes through the same training. They learn all the different avenues of the different type of clientele they may deal with, because on any given day, you may end up with any type of a client, so you need to know how to handle all types of clients. So we don't necessarily look at personality per se to decide who a case should be assigned to, but it will be considered if we realize that, for instance, someone may work better. We see there's a certain characteristic with this individual that might work better with this particular client. We go back and look at that if we see there are issues. We wouldn't be able to predict that when the client is first coming in. In regards to the type of training, we go through the means tests, which is knowing how to do the means test, what information we're looking for. We also go through, like I said, we do a separate training for mental health. How do we deal with those type of clients? The deputy over here go through training on sensitizing them on some of the social issues they may encounter. We have a training manual that they would go through, learning the policy. Our legislation is only a poor relief law that is 2 paragraphs, which we're now working on legislation, which is another challenge that we have. But they go through that type of training to get to know our organization and our clients before they're put at the front line by themselves and doing assessments one-on-one.
Who does the training? Is it in-house or is it external?
in-house for most of the, in most of the circumstances it's in-house, but for mental health it's with Ministry of Health. And when we do other customer service training that we bring persons externally to come in and do the training, dealing with difficult clients, that sort of stuff. But we do quite a bit in-house also, but we do secure a person from externally to also do training.
All right, my very last question, Mr. Chairman, sorry. Being the director there now for several years, what do you see as the next step forward, and what do you think we in this Legislative Assembly can do to make your department more efficient and basically provide better services to your clients? I mean, this is just your, I guess, parenting in terms of what we can do to make it better, because at the end of the day, it's important for the public to recognize that we're all on the same side, and your clients are still also my bosses too, because many of them are voters. Well, they're all voters, because you have to be Caymanian to receive the service. So what can we do better to help?
Loaded question. At the moment, my need at the moment is resources. I believe at the department, what we need is the bodies to do the work or the resources. It's not only about, like I said, having individuals, but even something like the database being upgraded so that we're able to do things more efficiently. Basically the resources and having a little more support per se, from the ministry and from everyone, in knowing that these are the needs of the needs assessment unit. I mean, my deputy and I are on the ground at the department, so we should know what the needs of the department is. We should know where we think the resources are needed, and actually having what we say be taken into consideration, and hopefully having that dialogue before decisions are made, being made aware of things that are about to happen before it actually happens. Because like I said, with the social worker positions that were advertised again last year, we found out, like the general public, when someone called and said, I see you're looking for a social worker, and then I went online and saw the ad. Just being aware of what's going on, because it's embarrassing when the public gets to know more information about what's going on at your department than the management team does. And as you can imagine, then my team comes to me and asks me about what's going on, and I'm just finding out like everyone else. So being more involved in decisions that impact our department would be definitely beneficial. And also, having our suggestions being taken into consideration for making future changes or creating efficiencies within our department.
Just one last thing I want to close on, and I'm glad Mr. Harris is here, my colleague from Prospect, is that ultimately, at least for me, where I sit, I look forward to the day when you don't need those resources, and that we have done a better job in terms of creating opportunities for people to help themselves. Because as I said earlier in one of my, the preamble to one of my questions, we do recognize the inadequacies within the pension laws. We do recognize the inadequacies in terms of providing health care for our people. And we do recognize that we are positioning the private sector workers to eventually become dependent on government. And that is something that I guess we in this house, all 19 of us, will have to find a way to fix. But they getting resources, I can tell you, is not something I'm keen. I would prefer to see those resources being spent in education and elsewhere to equip our people better, as opposed to on the other end. And I think ultimately that is where we need to get to. But tomorrow, I just want to say thanks very much for the work you're doing. I've called you late hours sometime on other people's behalf, and at 8, 9 o'clock you're still in the office, so I can speak firsthand from my own personal experience. You don't have an easy job. It's a very difficult task, and in essence you're dealing with some of the people that we in this house have failed. So in essence you're dealing with our mistakes sometimes to some extent, where we have not done enough. And I want to at least say on behalf, and I think my committee members would share the same thing, is to thank you and your team for the job that you're doing. Again, I say it's not easy, but at the end of the day, we're all human and everything else. So I really want to say thanks for everything that you're doing.
Thank you.
Mr. Jeffrey, you wanted to make an intervention?
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I just wanted to give the committee some brief information on an area that the committee seemed quite keen on previously, and I apologize for not jumping in at the time. It was about the area of recruitment and the ability of the NAU to essentially recruit autonomously for itself, control the timing, etc. Just to say, Mr. Chairman and committee members, that the Public Service Management Law does actually provide that ability for a chief officer to delegate HR responsibilities to a head of department, it's sometimes even described in the law as a manager, and typically that does actually take place. Just using myself as an example as a chief officer for the Ministry of Finance, heads of department, managers, they do have a delegated ability from me to not only hire and recruit staff, but to also, if necessary, terminate them. Those delegations do actually come with restrictions and subject to certain rules, and it's very typical that the delegation will say a head of department can recruit, but the chief officer shall ultimately approve what the recommendation is. But that's quite a lot more efficient than the chief officer, the ministry controlling the timing, etc. Because normally as a chief officer, what you get is a panel report saying, we recommend Mr. Brown. Do you agree, yes or no? And that's maybe a 10-minute job. So the ability to delegate responsibility for HR functions is there under the Public Service Management Law.
Thanks very much for that, Mr. Jefferson, because I was actually planning on raising that to the chief officer when they came in. So you have at least, don't worry, it's there. Thanks.
Okay. And if there are no other questions, I'd just like to take the opportunity to endorse what Mr. Chris said tomorrow. I think you seem to be doing a good job under some trying circumstances, which I must tell you, I'm rather disappointed that had not been relieved based on what we were promised in July 2018. But I beg you to soldier on, and as I think it was Bob, I said, better must come. But thank you very much for your time. And
Thank you, and if I could just go on record to say, because I know my staff is watching, they've been praying, and I just want them to know that, you know, they're doing a great job, they're doing an excellent job, and my nights are not like their nights. I have officers leaving at 1 a.m. in the morning, literally tripping the alarm sometimes that I have to get up and see what's going on, and they do this without compensation. They do it because they do genuinely care about the public and they care about our clients, and at the end of the day, I think all that we really want at the department is to ensure that we are servicing our most vulnerable, and that's why the staff that we do have, and we do have some who have been there from the very beginning, and they trooper on and they work the endless hours because of their dedication to the public and to the Cayman Islands government. And for that, I would like to say thank you to them, because I don't think I would have been able to troop on if I didn't have that type of a team behind me.
Sorry, Mr. Chairman, one question. Do your staff get paid overtime?
Not at the moment. They don't get paid overtime.
Oh, hell no. Okay, thanks very much.
Okay. You're welcome.
Mr. Sergeant, can you bring in Miss Engineer, please, when you take these on? Okay, well, we're going to take 5 minutes, so I'll let you know when to come in. Okay.